All right, welcome back, everybody. We talked about the origins of the Cold War last time. The world is reorienting itself from a multipolar war, many or world, many great powers, into what we would call a bipolar world. Just two poles or polarities there: the United States, the Soviet Union, and the world is kind of finding its way at this time. New institutions are being built, a lot of foreign policy in the last lecture. This will be much more about the home front and what was going on in America mid-century in the 1950s. So last time we ended with Korea, and there's this sort of time period that's about 10 years from the end of Korea to the assassination of John F. Kennedy in November of 1963 that we generally call that 10-year window the 50s, even though, the last part of it's the early 60s. Um, this man, who I'm sure you're all going to know, oops, I got to share my screen, right? Otherwise, you guys can't see my lecture. Um, this man here, Elvis Presley, perhaps the most famous American of the 1950s, typified the times, essentially. Um, he was an incredible singer, a sex symbol, and just drove people crazy. Either you loved him or you thought he was going to be the end of all humanity. And rock and roll is born, and America's never the same afterwards. So let's talk about what's going on here. So first of all, this is the president of this era, the 50s. This is Dwight D Eisenhower. Um, he was not considered a bad president when he was president. Most people called him a caretaker president. Ike was not very charismatic, did not speak very well, but commanded sort of an honest authority about him. He was, squeaky clean when it came to government, had a flawless reputation for always doing the right thing and just being a good person. And in retrospect, we look back and we say, you know what? He really did a very fine job as president. He probably his greatest achievement is that he kept us out of World War III at one of the most dangerous times in American history when the Cold War was first beginning. Um, Truman perhaps got lucky, or maybe he had some wisdom there, but I got into quite a few tight spots there and kept us from blowing each other up, which was pretty good. So thank you, Ike, for that. Now, the 50s forever holds this very nostalgic period for many Americans. Now, like so many things in history, it's a complicated picture. We're a big country, and it's hard to say America was this or America was that, right? Like 50s is a lot like the 20s, where the overall narrative is very hard to pin down. Was the 20s a liberal time because it was the Roaring 20s, and you have jazz and flappers and people going out and celebrating, right? Um, Yes, but it was also the America of prohibition. Alcohol was completely illegal. That doesn't sound very liberal. That's pretty conservative, actually. The KKK was at an all-time high. It was the third largest party in America, 3 million members by 1924. There was no immigration to America in the 20s. And so were we liberal or conservative? Well, we're a big country. We're very divided. The 50s also, liberals today want to look back and say the 50s was terrible, too much conformity, racism, etc. And conservatives look back and say, it was the greatest period in American history. It was after World War II. So America is the leader of the free world. We have this new leadership role. People, probably the biggest difference between now and the 1950s is public confidence in all institutions. Um, since the 1970s, Americans have grown very cynical. There's no institution of any kind that's universally respected anymore, be it politicians, the press, church, whatever it might be. We're very cynical about everything. Anytime any person of any authority, moral, political, or economic, uh, talks about a particular issue, they're always going to be dragged down because there's some element of American society that does not like them. Who's universally respected today? In the 50s, it was a time where it was much more deferential for whatever reason. Old folks are right when they tell you, when I was a kid in Los Altos, Long Beach, or Lakewood in the 50s, we didn't lock our doors. The crime rate was really low. There were no gangs. There were no drugs. And by and large, they're not lying. The 50s was, in many ways, a very special time in American history. Like I said, crime rates were very, very low. The economy had never been better. Everyone was moving into the middle class in some way. Um, as I said, you didn't have to worry that your kids were going to, fall into some horrible problem with gangs or drugs or anything like that. It was just kind of a more innocent society in many, many ways. Um, but don't believe all the hype. There were certainly none of you guys listening to this now would want to go back to the 50s. If I could get the time machine, get Marty and Doc in the DeLorean and say, let's go back to 1955, most of you would say, hell no. First of all, no cell phones or anything like that. So information you got to look up in a book. But much more important things. Women just had no role in society other than wife and mother. That was it. My mother graduated high school in 1964, and her father, who was about as woke as you could get in the 60s, told her when she graduated high school, what do you want to do? Do you want to be wife and mother and just get married, or do you want to have a career? And he told her, he said, I think you should have a career, because just in case your husband ever leaves you or passes away, you want to be able to be self-sufficient. That's pretty progressive for the early 60s. So she said, I want to be independent. And he said, okay, you got two choices. You can either be a teacher or a nurse. That was it. This is 1964, folks. I'm not talking about the 20s. I'm not talking about 100 years ago. My mother, she's older. She's 74, but this is the way it was when she graduated high school. Women were not really allowed to be doctors, lawyers, have any role in the military, police force, firefighter, nothing like that, nothing at all. And surely many of you today are probably saying, well, Osborne, it's not perfect. There's still a ton of discrimination against women. Look at the Me Too movement. I'm not diminishing that at all, but you can't deny that progress has been made. There's more women in Congress now than ever before. Women are running for president. We have a woman vice president. Things have definitely improved on that front line. But then again, the world's a lot less innocent as well. So let's talk about how this world was built, basically. So what conservatives forget and what liberals fantasize was this very sort of socialistic system we had in the 50s that was really left over from the New Deal. Republicans realized that they were never going to get elected in America, promising to dismantle the New Deal. They tried that a number of times. Alf Landon tried that in 36, and he got stomped. FDR destroyed him. Wendell Willkie said that in 1940. Thomas Dewey said it in 44 and 48 and got defeated twice. They kept promising, we're going to shred up the New Deal and go back to the way things were. People didn't want to. Coming through the 30s and World War II, most Americans said, we do need to take care of each other in some capacity. And when Eisenhower got in there, he was a Republican president, and he had a Republican Congress for at least part of his presidency for about 2 years there. He could have dismantled the New Deal. He chose not to. Republicans hated the unions and how strong they were in America at this time, yet he made peace with them. He agreed that wages should be high. If you work at General Motors, even as a janitor, you should be able to buy a GM car. And so unions were very strong. And this created what economists call the Great Compression, meaning that prior to World War II, America was a very unequal society. The rich were super rich and the poor were super poor. And that all got compressed after the war. Number one, taxes got very high during World War II, not during the New Deal, but to fund the war, FDR passed the most progressive tax laws we ever had, where Americans at the bottom were paying hardly anything. Americans at the top were paying a fortune. There was a 91% tax rate on the super rich, which today we would just say that's communism, right? Not even Bernie Sanders, not even AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, not even they are calling for a 91% rate of taxation on the super rich. They're calling for 39%. Some are calling for 50% or 45%, which is high, mind you, but historically speaking, nowhere near what it was in the 50s. The rich paid a fortune. And so all these mansions out on Long Island that were in the Great Gatsby, these 82 bedroom mansions, they all got turned over to the state. in the 50s. You just couldn't afford to run them anymore. You couldn't have an army of servants running the place and people out tending to the grounds. They became museums, hospitals, right? Look at the Huntington Library, right? That was a mansion for the Huntington family, and then it became a museum later on. Same thing with the Getty, right? Same thing with Hearst Castle. These were all just private residences. And then after a while, they just said the tax rates are insane and we can't afford to run it. So we're just turning it over. They became hospitals. They became, all kinds of different things, museums. By the way, those are opening up again because the tax rates are much lower on the rich now. And we see this wealth stratification again, very unequal. In the 50s, it was much more equal. Now, it's not always perfect. If you actually read the fine details, certain industries were unionized, certain weren't. And it blows my mind to read that steel workers and miners in the 40s and 50s actually made more than teachers, which to me, sorry to the miners and the steel workers, I don't think that they should make more. Teachers have college educations. Now, why is that? That was because women mostly were teachers, and women were not unionized. Women had this high turnover rate. Ladies, if you were a teacher, one of the few professions you could have, and you got pregnant, you would have to go home. It was like indecent for pregnant women to be out in public. I mean, the children are going to ask questions, right? That's the society that we were. Nowadays, it's no big thing, right? Probably all of you have had a female teacher at some point in your life who was pregnant and who had to go on maternity leave, and we're all very supportive of that now. Wasn't that way before. So you got a mixed bag. There are things about the 50s most of us could look back and say, that's great. There are other things that we say, geez, that's horrible. Subsidizing the suburbs, the FHA, we talked about that last time, how people were moving out of urban areas. The most urban census we ever had was 1940, right on the cusp of World War II. More Americans were living in big cities than ever before. And then after the war, people flocked to the suburbs. The suburbs become the desired place to live because the crime rates are much lower than the city. You can drive into the city in 30 minutes or an hour to go see, your play, your musical at the theater, to go enjoy the culture that the big city has to offer. But then you can go back home to your quiet neighborhood where you don't have to deal with all the problems of big cities. And the federal government really built the suburbs. They subsidized it. They spent a fortune. We had to build a whole highway system to get people in and out of the suburbs, right? Because all these roads were, not built yet and everything was disconnected. Federal government did this. Ike, a Republican, spent a fortune on the Federal Highway Act in 1956, building the freeway system that we have today. The best in the world, right? We don't tend to it that well, but it's the only country on earth that has such a integrated network of highways and roads. What this means is America's going to invest through roads in cars, because that's how you get around in a car, and they're going to stop investing in trains and other forms of public transportation. Americans don't like public transportation. Some people in big cities take subways, but there are no major train tracks that link the major cities of America. We do have Amtrak, but by world standards, it's horrible, and almost nobody uses it. We're just a different country. We're individualistic, and the car is an individualistic thing, but government does have to build the roads. And then the 50s had, above all else, it represented a baby boom. The baby boom is really a fascinating phenomenon. We were unique in that the birth rate skyrocketed in America. Almost no other country did that happen. It happened, very interestingly enough, in English-speaking countries away from the front lines in World War II. Translation: Canada, the United States, Australia, New Zealand. Those four countries experienced a big baby boom, an increase in birth rate in the 50s. Europe did not. The birth rate actually declined. Now, birth rates increasing could be signs of a lot of things. In this instance, what it represents is wealth and hopefulness. Americans were very hopeful in the 50s that the future would be better than the past. Europeans were positively depressed. They had just lived through the worst catastrophe in human history, fought in their countries, and very little people had faith that the future was going to be bright. They had faith in America, but they didn't have faith much in their own leaders. In America, people were planning for the future. Now, what was happening was, you had a generation of women born in the teens who came of age in the 30s and who had delayed having children because they were too poor and their, potential mate just did not have steady work. On top of that generation, you had a second generation of women born in the 20s, like my grandmother, who experienced the Depression as young children, but came of age during World War II and had all this pent-up demand, like, I want to get married and have my first child, right? My grandmother was 22 when World War II ended, and she had her first child at 24. My mother, right? She was not. It was 1947, and my grandmother was like, "Let's settle down and have kids." But there was a generation of women 10, 15 years older than her that were having their first kid at 35 and 36. And so they were trying to have two, three, four kids right away. Women like my grandmother trying to have four kids, but spaced out more over time, and they overlaid on top of each other. And so what you got was this huge explosion in the birth rate. The birth rate went way up, doubled to 4 children per family. And a lot of people thought, well, what's happening is people were delaying having kids during the war when it was, life was crazy. You're going to see a blip for about 4 or 5 years and then it'll settle down. That's not true. The birth rate does not come down until 1960. It took 15 years for it to come down. And not so coincidentally, it comes down the year that the birth control pill is approved by the FDA and women can legally avail themselves of it in every state in the union. But the cry of the child was everywhere. It was this kind of weird existence where everyone was having kids. They had to rapidly build hospitals and, of course, suburbs to house everybody. And just everyone was raising kids at this particular time. Ladies, it was like you and all your girlfriends all had kids and you get together and do it, and everything revolved around your kids. Now, this generation is aging, and you guys have your own little phrases for them, right? Like, okay, boomer. Because they're older and they like to tell you about the way that life was. So boomers really are people born between 1943, kind of when World War II got started, and 1960. My parents are both early boomers. My father born in 1943, my mother 1947. It's no coincidence that we've had 3 presidents all born during the summer of 1946. Bill Clinton, born in, I believe, August of 1946, George W. Bush in July of 46, and Donald Trump in June of 46. Why is the summer of 46 unique? Well, the war ended in September of 45. If you fast forward 9 months, that's the summer of 1946. This is the first wave of the baby boom when it really spikes, right? It goes up a bit in 43 and 44, but it really peaks in the summer of 46 and then goes up from there. 9 months from the end of the war. Okay, people were excited to get married, settle down, and start having a family. They had delayed that for so long, and so that became a fixture in American life, this demographic bubble, essentially, that continues on to this day. There's a huge group of older Americans because the birth rate was so high. My parents' generation had far fewer kids, right? The women who came of age in the 60s and 70s were utilizing birth control, had 2 kids, and the birth rate is going to steadily decline for the last 50, 60 years. So, mother's little helper. This is what conservatives won't tell you about the 50s and what liberals are always pointing out, was that it was a very stifling culture for women, for minorities, for everything. Probably the biggest discomfort you guys would all have if we could go back in time to the 50s is just how formal everyone was. I, for instance, I typically, when I go to work, I'll wear tennis shoes, jeans, and, a sweater or a polo to work. That would be considered just unacceptable in the 1950s. You had to wear a suit and tie and jacket. And most men would have to ask all the ladies in the room, is it okay if I remove my jacket? Because it's July and it's 95 degrees. If men ever left the house, they'd have to get dressed in a 3-piece suit. You never were seen in public wearing shorts ever, not even in California. You never wore sandals. You wore dress shoes every single day with a suit. Ladies did not wear jeans. Ladies wore dresses all the time with stockings. Now, this might seem silly to a lot of people, but imagine a world where they forced you to dress this way. Government didn't do it, but it was a society type thing where you would lose friends, you'd be made fun of, you'd be ridiculed, and no one really lived that way. The only time you'd wear a t-shirt and jeans and shoes is if you were in your yard doing work or in your garage fixing up your car. That was work attire, like working class work attire, to get greasy and messy. This is how we dress all the time now, right? You just roll out of bed in your PJs and head into Walmart, right? And it's fine, no big deal, right? women had very few opportunities in the 50s, yet they were under all this pressure because consumerism would be a major fixture in American life in the 50s. We need that second car, right? In the 20s, most Americans had one car. In the 50s, most Americans got that second car because a lot of women would say, you know, husband, you're taking the car to work. I wish I could go to the grocery store and buy all those groceries. Instead, we have to like share the car back and forth, or you have to take public transportation. Excuse me. Let's get that second car. Well, mother, in order to get that second car, you will have to get a job as well. And so there's this weird notion we have that women were housewives and stayed home in the 50s. That's not quite true. More American women were working in the 50s than in the 40s, meaning even Rosie the Riveter during the 40s, when all these women went into the workplace, they increasingly went into the workplace in the 50s. Now, the problem and the difference was that they weren't working at jobs in a union where they were highly skilled and they got good wages. They were becoming secretaries and bank tellers and jobs like that that did not have a union wage, and women were paid less for doing the same work. If you had a male employee and a female employee, you always pay the female employee less because this weird logic existed where the man supports the family, so he's got a whole family to support. The woman is married to a man who already has a job, and so therefore her income is like gravy, it's like extra, and so therefore we can pay her less. Okay, man, we have to pay more because he has this burden, right? It's this weird logical notion that women somehow don't have families and they don't support their families. Well, that was the logic of the time. You want to give first dibs to a man because men support families. Women, it's like, you know, it'd be nice to have that extra income. That was the logic of the time. And so women had this pressure, I have to go out and work, but the work wasn't fulfilling. It wasn't your identity. It wasn't like, you know, you derived a lot of job satisfaction from it. And yet there was all this pressure to have dinner ready when, you know, husband came home, that you had to help kids with their homework. Fathers did nothing like that. It's quite interesting, you know. My son, my wife and I are very equally hands-on with it. I learned to do all the stuff that traditionally women have done for a long time. I learned how to, you know, change diapers and, you know, feed a child when they're very young, burp them, put them to bed, and do all of that stuff because I wanted to be very hands-on. I went to every doctor's appointment he's ever had. I remember my mother telling me a couple of years ago, she's like, I think it's really great that you go to the doctor's appointments with your wife. She's like, your father never went to a single doctor's appointment ever. Men weren't expected to. It was considered like that's women's work. And guys, it wasn't necessarily that you as an individual were being a jerk. That was the world you were raised in. And if your friends knew or saw that you had an apron on in the kitchen, you would be teased to the end of humanity. Who wears the pants in your family? You're whipped. You know, your woman dominates you. And so there was this tremendous societal pressure of bifurcation of gender roles. Men make a living and women work in the kitchen, and there is no overlap between the two. Men should just come home, get a drink, put their feet up, and like the kitchen's a foreign country to them. They've never sat foot in it. They don't know how to change a diaper. Mom's got to do both at the same time. And so women really record a lot of unhappiness during this time period. It's papered over by the fact that, you know, all of our sitcoms at the time, like Leave It to Beaver and Donna Reed, show a happy woman. But that's not the way it really was. We know that there were record numbers of women talking to their doctor saying, I'm very unhappy because my life is facilitating everyone else's life. My kid's is the star, you know, baseball player on his team, and I just help him, right? I assist in that. My husband's, you know, got this great promotion and great job, and I just help him by ironing his shirts and stuff like that. What do? I'm just mom. I facilitate everyone else. Where's my existence? Women were told you shouldn't have one. You should be supporter. You should be, you know, mother. Women who wanted to have careers were told they were selfish. Women were told that if you put your kid in a daycare and you do not raise them from 0 to 5, your child will become a criminal, they will become a homosexual, etc., which is offensive on so many levels, but that's what people thought. We didn't have the world we have today where most of you, I would imagine, were in daycare at some point in your life because mom wanted to have a career as well. So women, by and large, did not have careers. They had a lot of stress. And there was this wonderful Rolling Stones song called Mother's Little Helper that explained this, that Valium became a new drug on the market. Valium's a tranquilizer, like, Xanax that you take for anxiety. And women were taking it at night to get to sleep. And there were a record number of millions of prescriptions written in the 50s because women were stifled under this very difficult environment, as I would imagine anyone would be. So, unions, very, very strong. I've gone over that before. I've spent a lot of time on that slide. So we need to go to the next one, and that's Mr. James Dean here. As much as we look back and we love the 50s, understand that when people lived in the 50s, there were critics as well. There's going to be haters in every society. People who lived in the 50s noticed that it was incredibly stifling, that men were terrified not to stand out. The fashion at the time was that you wore a white shirt, black tie, black slacks, black shoes, black jacket. That's it. You weren't supposed to wear these avant-garde colors like pink and purple and red and stuff like that. You would stand out. People would think you were weird. What's wrong with you? Why are you trying to stand out? Everyone wanted to blend in. Historians believe this is probably because those quota systems we passed in the 20s, really, we started to see the effects in the 50s, meaning we had had no immigration pretty much for 30 years. Pretty much everybody had been born in America and had been homogenized. By the 50s, what you start to see is Italian and Irish people become quote unquote white. That there used to be a tremendous amount of discrimination against some white people in America, against Jews, against Italians, against the Irish because they were either Catholic or Jewish. Most of that discrimination falls by the wayside in the 50s, and all these people become quote unquote white. Remember, there used to be a hierarchy of whiteness, right? If you were white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, you were at the top, and then there was kind of, other levels there. That falls by the wayside because largely those immigrant groups had come sometime before, and now they were born in America, and they had intermarried with everybody else, and not everybody else, but white folks in America. And so it was boring. It was the same. Everybody, complained about the conformity of this era. Lots of literature in the 50s about how everyone just wanted to be the same. Everyone wanted to live in the suburbs where you couldn't even find your own house because it was identical to everybody else's. Lots of literature written about this by great writers like Dwight MacDonald and C. Wright Mills. And then there was an artistic movement that fought against it. Poets, musicians, these people typically were called the Beats, they called themselves, but everyone else called them beatniks. They grew their hair out shaggy. If they were men, their hair, not even long by today's standards, but just a little shaggy. Some of them grew little soul patches or goatees. And then they would hang around coffee houses, and they wouldn't wear a jacket or a tie, just a regular shirt. They'd wear their Chuck Taylor Converse out in public, and they would sit around in these coffee bars, and many of them would smoke marijuana and listen to poetry. And, they'd sit back and listen, and they invented a new way of applause. Instead of applauding, they would like snap their fingers like that and go, groovy, right? Great job, Daddy-O. My favorite is you're a total L7, right? You're a total square. You're just boring. Many people ridiculed the beatniks, but they would win in the end. By the 60s, that's how everybody was. Everybody was more casual. Everybody was more open to new ideas. Music was going to change. There would be a social revolution in America in the 60s, and the beatniks were in on that at the very beginning. But at the time, they seemed positively funny to a lot of people, like, get a job, you lazy bum, that kind of stuff. So there were all of these complaints at the time. Don't kid yourself. We've so romanticized the 50s. So many Americans, oh, that was the classic time. I want to go back to that time because it was more traditional. But people complained at the time about other aspects of it. There's no glory age where everyone was happy and everything was great in American history. There's always pluses and minuses to every era. So, make sure you remember that. Because of the GI Bill, there was an explosion in universities. Americans were investing in education because of the GI Bill. We spent a fortune. Remember, 16.5 million young men now could get low interest loans to buy a home and could get free money to go to college. It's amazing how generous Uncle Sam was. And so there weren't enough universities to accommodate all the men who now had the GI Bill and wanted to get an education. They rapidly built universities all over America. Think of your local university, Cal State Long Beach. The mascot until very recently was the 49er, because California becomes a state in 1850 and the gold rush was 1849. And Cal State Long Beach was built exactly 100 years later in 1949. Why was it built in 1949? Because Lakewood and Los Altos are built and open in the late 40s and early 50s. And all those men who had the GI Bill needed to go to a college. There weren't enough. And so they rapidly built colleges all over the country to accommodate this. There was a whole generation of young people, young men, but women were going to college too. They just couldn't avail themselves of the GI Bill as much, who now had an education. The standard went up in America for education. More educated population means more people making more money. Millions of Americans moved into the middle class through buying a home in the suburbs and through getting an education. And so standard of living went up. People now live in these nice homes that are brand new. There's refrigerators, there's wonderful electric lighting. Some people have pools in their backyard. It was great. It was wonderful. Millikan High School opened in 1956. And amazingly, and this may shock you, it was mostly an all-white high school when it opened up. Not that California had actual de jure segregation, it had more what you would call de facto segregation, segregation by fact, that the housing covenants in Lakewood and Los Altos said, if you buy this home, you cannot rent or sell to Black people. And so it was very white, and all the kids that went there were, mostly white. How California's changed in the last 50 years. Medicine had a quantum leap in the 50s. Polio, this horrible affliction that had crippled or killed millions of Americans, including Franklin Roosevelt, a cure came out in the mid-50s. In fact, I've seen a lot of posts recently from baby boomers who, like my parents, born in the 40s, took the polio vaccine when they were 12 years old, and now they're taking this new vaccine, and they're, talking about how it was distributed. What's amazing to me is how they distributed the polio vaccine. Polio, remember, is a waterborne virus. You stay out of lakes, streams, ponds, stuff like that. And when the vaccine came out, they distributed it on trucks, these black trucks that had kind of stencil with white paint on it that essentially said Dr. Salk's polio cure. And they had like a big bell, like an ice cream truck. And they would drive through neighborhoods, and you'd go out, and there were these guys on the back of the trucks that would take a little sugar cube and drop, a little vaccine on it and give it to kids. And then you would pop it in your mouth, suck on the sugar cube, and then you would be vaccinated. I do not think that this would work today. There's all kinds of conspiracy theories about vaccines now. Again, like I said, people had more trust in authority back then. If people in a white lab coat told you a vaccine was safe, you accepted it. If the president told you that X was true, it was true. If your church leader said, this is what you do, you did it. People just respected elders. They respected institutions a lot more. We don't respect anything anymore, for good or for bad. It's just very different. So all these vaccines come out. Life expectancy then increases greatly. In the 30s, life expectancy was about 62, 63. It jumps up about 7 or 8 years by the 1960s, mostly from all these medicines that come out. People started to get health insurance from their job, weirdly enough, because of these World War II restrictions. There's a lot of talk in the 50s about whether we should do what Britain and these other countries are doing, having socialized medicine. The government pays for it. But this weird outcome of wage controls and price controls was now that certain businesses were offering it. Now it was expected. And so this competition kicked in where different jobs start offering it. Some jobs don't, but many in the middle class are starting to do that. And so they're building more hospitals, people get more healthcare. Kaiser Permanente becomes one of these big ones because the war industrialist Henry Kaiser, who had built ships during World War II, started offering that. And so other employers say, all right, we have to offer our own healthcare network as well to our employees. And this system starts to develop. And of course, you have teenage culture. The term teenager is coined in the 50s. There had never before been a concept. The word just never existed before. It's very interesting when you look at sort of the history of childhood. There used to be this concept that children were sort of just miniature versions of adults, that there were no such thing as kids' clothes. You just dress little boys in full suits, you dress little girls in nice dresses. And they never really had a chance to be little boys and little girls. They just went along with mom and dad everywhere. They didn't make entertainment pretty much for kids. Kids, you get to watch the 5-minute cartoon before the movie, but you're going to sit through the boring 2-hour movie. You're going to sit there and you're going to like it. Nowadays, I think of my own life, most of the entertainment we do, the kid decides what we're going to do. On a weekend, during a summer vacation, we ask the kid, what would you like to do, Junior? And we almost always pick a place based on what he wants to do. Do you want to go to the zoo, the amusement park? Do you want to see this? Do you want to see that? We're not going to take him to some boring museum that he's going to hate because he's going to be a pill. And you can't slap your kids around in public anymore, right? That's a joke, perhaps not a very funny one, but that's actually very true. that in the 50s it was perfectly okay to, quote, discipline your child very publicly, and it's not considered okay anymore. Parenting manuals are different. You're not supposed to spank anymore, etc. So parents just kind of told kids, be happy with what you have. There was a saying in the 50s, you're better seen and not heard, right? Children are these wonderful, beautiful things, but keep your mouth closed, right? Don't complain. Don't ask me for help. Just go do it on your own. We don't want to, get bothered by all this stuff. My mother tells me that she remembers on many occasions that other adults, not her parents, would discipline her all the time in public. It was very common for, like, if you went to a dinner party with your parents, another adult would give you a spanking, or tell if you were mouthing off or doing something wrong, they would come up to you and dress you down. I would never think of doing that now, because that's just crossing the line. And I wouldn't want someone to do that to my kid, and I wouldn't do it to any other kid. So society's just way different now than it used to be. The concept teenager comes out mostly because of our affluence, because Americans are so wealthy. Teenagers can get jobs. There were no jobs in Europe for teenagers because they had such high unemployment even for adults. Teenagers start to get these jobs. In-N-Out Burger opens up, I believe, in 1948. And so that's a perfect job for a teenager, right? Is that you got, young kids on roller skates that go out and they put the little thing, like, on your car window, and you can eat there. You guys ever been to In-N-Out where they ask you, are you eating this in your car? Every time they ask that to me, it sounds positively humiliating. I'm like, what kind of sad person do you think I am when I just ordered 4 hamburgers that I'm going to eat in my car? That's the saddest thing I've ever heard. I will say I have a friend who he did this for a while because his wife was pregnant and suffering morning sickness, and he was not allowed to bring In-N-Out Burger home because it made his wife nauseous, so he had to eat it in the car. But that just sounds sad. It's not something you celebrate, right? This is because it used to be a teenage thing to do. It was a car culture. Cars were cheap. Kids would get the keys to the car on Fridays and Saturdays, and they would go out and they would go have fun. And they'd go to In-N-Out Burger, drive-in movie theaters. Everything was related to cars, or just cruising, right? That's what my father used to do in the 50s for fun. You just get in your car and just drive up and down PCH, just looking around, wasting gas, right? That seems insane to us today. We drive to get to a location and then walk around and have fun. But it used to be you would just drive around, spend the whole night in your car checking out things. Now that the kids have these jobs and have money, businesses start thinking, how do we get our hands on this money? What do kids want? And they found that young teenage girls wanted to buy makeup because they wanted to, mature and grow up and be independent. Young boys wanted to buy comic books and skateboards and bikes and stuff like that. Now, I'm not suggesting that they're, please don't get me wrong in thinking that, boys always want this and girls always want that, but just, that's what people thought at the time. In any case, businesses emerged to get their hands on the money of teenagers, so they started catering to the needs of the teenager. So you get movies for the first time where the whole cast is teenagers. Movies starring James Dean. Rebel Without a Cause is one of these teenage movies where it's told through the point of view of young people. No movies had ever been made like that before, or television shows or anything. Teenagers, it was thought they didn't even really exist in society. Now there's this term, and teenagers have their own music, rock and roll. They have their own movies, these teenage movies, etc. And so this was new and exciting. And so this whole culture that separated itself from the adult culture, that's really what we mean by teenage culture. It's a subculture of a certain society that's different than the main culture at large. And it emerged in America first, mostly because of affluence, because teenagers have money. And of course, television. Television, can't talk about the 50s without talking about television. By 1960, 90% of American households had TVs. In 1950, it was a very low statistic. I'm not sure exactly what it was, but it's not until the mid to late 50s where pretty much everybody can get a TV. Now, the TVs were horrible quality. They were black and white. They were about this big. You had one in your household. Nowadays, there's screens in every room of the house. Plus, you have your phone and your iPads, and you can take them anywhere. They had these little like antennas on the top. I'm old enough where I remember having to do that you'd have an antenna on your roof that, you'd cut a hole in the ceiling and it would come down and plug into the back of your TV, and then you kind of fine tune it with the rabbit ears on top of the TV. And you had 3 channels, CBS, NBC, ABC. Yet it took off like wildfire. Everybody wanted a TV, and everybody got one pretty much in the 50s. Now this changed society forever. It changed culture, it changed politics, it changed marketing, it changed everything. And it really homogenized the culture. This is something probably you guys, it would seem weird to you, but when I was a kid, even like I said, when I was a kid, there was cable, but almost nobody had it. It was very expensive. And we were all watching the same TV shows. And when there's only 3 channels, there's only like 15 shows on at any, given moment in history, and everyone was watching it. You don't have to ask, did you watch I Love Lucy last night? Yes, we all watched it. That was all that was on. Um, Now, since there's so many different channels, so many different forms of entertainment, so many different streaming services and everything, I could ask each one of you, what's your favorite show? And you would have a different answer, and no one's watching the same thing, or only small proportions are watching the same thing. We're not all watching the same show at the same time. And so society is much more diffuse at this particular time. In the 50s, it was very homogenized. Everyone was watching the same thing. So everyone knew the same culture and cultural norms. So you could create fads very easily, like the hula hoop. The hula hoop comes out in 1958. It's weird that nobody had invented the hula hoop. It's just a circle, but it comes out in 1958. There's a couple of commercials for it, and everybody went out and bought it. So it's very easy to create fads when there's only 3 channels on. They use the same model that they used from radio. And the British copy their system too. They take the BBC and, radio turns into television, essentially, where government owns the airwaves there. In America, we were very afraid of government owning our media, and we didn't want that. And so we license it to private companies, ABC, NBC, CBS. And so they own these 3 networks, and there's going to be intense regulations on them because you can only have 3 channels broadcast. The technology only would allow that. And you had to get a license, and you had to adhere to certain guidelines to get that license. That means no swear words. That means, no nudity. That means you have to have the news. You guys ever notice that there's news hours? Like 6 o'clock is a news hour, and 247 all have it. It's because by law they have to, right? Cable networks, because of the nature of the medium, there's an infinite number of cable stations you can have. Therefore, they can do whatever they want. If you have 247, you need a license, and therefore you have to show the news, because the feeling was, if you just allow the market to take control, people don't want to watch the news. They want to watch entertainment. Companies will show that entertainment, and we'll all be incredibly stupid and ignorant for the rest of our lives. No one will buy newspapers anymore, was the fear. They'll just sit and watch TV and just be entertained, and there won't be any news. If the government makes you show news, then everyone's on an even playing field. And then the companies will say, well, nobody's making money during the news hours because it's boring. And that's what happens every time when you look at the charts. The Super Bowl's on, and then the news hour comes on afterwards, and it just drops off a cliff. No one wants to watch that, right? Same thing in the 50s, but because it was on and every channel had the news on, people just sat through it and then waited for their show to come back on. Shows were bland and boring in the 50s. Companies, above all else, wanted to avoid controversy. They didn't want to get boycotted. And so there was no racy kind of stuff on TV. It really is astonishing when you look back how bland, boring, and vacuous a lot of these shows are. Some of them were a little edgier, like I Love Lucy, or like this one here, The Honeymooners, a wonderful TV show. But by and large, the vast majority of what was on was just boring beyond belief. I don't know if you guys have watched like these old Nickelodeon Nick at Night reruns of shows in the 50s, but Amazon Prime has a lot of them. Go watch an episode of Leave It to Beaver. It's 25 minutes long. Beaver's the name of this kid. That's his nickname. Wally's his brother. They'll go and play baseball in the first minute or so, and they'll hit a ball through a neighbor's window, and then they spend 18 minutes fretting over what do we do, and then Beaver at the end says, Dad, I had to tell you I broke the neighbor's window, and Dad tells him, you learned a valuable lesson about honesty, and then the music comes on at the end, and that's the show. And there's a couple of jokes sprinkled in there that aren't very funny. There were no minorities on television, no women that had any kind of career. No one was a drug addict or an alcoholic on TV. There was no sex out of wedlock. No one had an illegitimate child. Nobody was divorced. It was the sanitary, bizarre world, a fantasy world that only existed on TV, right? One of the worst representations of history is watching television and saying, this is how people lived at the time. You can get a decent idea of it, but just watching that's not how life actually was. The Honeymooners was much more realistic. The Honeymooners, if you've never seen it, is the story of Ralph Cramden, pictured here. He was a bus driver in New York City. Most shows in the 50s, people lived in the suburbs. People didn't live in big cities on these shows, and yet Honeymooners, they did. They lived in a ratty neighborhood, in a ratty apartment. Ralph was a bus driver, which is a working class job. He didn't wear a jacket and tie, you know. I guess technically he does here, but you know, not in the white collar sense, right? Um, and he was miserable in his work. He hated it. He always had a scheme. The plot of every Honeymooners episode is like, I got to get rich quick scheme. My friend told me how I can quit this darn job and make it. And it never worked out. And Alice, his wife, would always tell him what a loser and how stupid he was. And he would yell and holler at her and stuff like that. And they could never have a family or have kids because Ralph had such a poor job, basically. His best friend, Ed Norton, who lived across the hall, was a sewer cleaner. So very weird show, way out of its time, but very good. Probably the best of the era. I Love Lucy is also quite a good show, but also weird when you guys watch it. If you guys have watched I Love Lucy, you probably noticed husband and wife, yet they sleep in separate beds in the same room. That's just bizarre. And nobody lived that way in the 50s, yet that was what was on TV. It was considered scandalous if a man and woman were in bed together on television, even though they were married, right? Their bathroom does not have a toilet. If you guys have noticed that, no toilet could even be shown on television. The first time a toilet was ever shown in a movie was the movie Psycho, 1960. And it blew people's minds because there was, oh my God, there's a toilet. Like, how vulgar, right? How the standards have changed in American life. Anything's okay to put on TV nowadays, right? Or on the screen. So again, lots of limitations with the art in the 50s because the medium was so compressed because there were just 3 channels and it was so regulated. The art was scrutinized and very bland and very dull. Not like today where you have just wonderful freedom to kind of say and do what you want. So let's move on here and talk about the Cold War and like international relations. So what had started with Truman in the 40s would continue on throughout the 50s. It's very interesting. When the Cold War began, no one knew that it was going to be this generational long thing. Truman told people that, but it was like they didn't hear him, that this was going to be everyone alive today, you will not see the end of the Cold War. It's going to last multiple lifetimes. And yet Americans were impatient. They were like, let's get this over with. Ike finally got people to realize that by just kind of hammering the point home by saying, we're not going to go to war with the Soviets, but we're going to develop other strategies to contain the spread of communism. So Ike gets in there and he decides that we need a few other mechanisms to stop the spread of communism other than just like going to war or dropping, bombs on people. Although both of those, avenues are equally important. We're going to develop more nuclear weapons and more ways of delivering them, meaning more missiles and, guidance systems and bases and things like that. We are going to have to increase the budget of the CIA. When we don't want to invade a country, when we want to topple a government or rig an election or spy on people, we got to, be able to better handle that. Because the military, like I was saying before, it's a blunt instrument. You can't use it for every crisis in the world. For instance, there was a huge uprising in Hungary in 1956 in October. The people there decided they didn't want the Soviet communist system anymore. They rose up and took control of the government, encouraged by us, by the way, because we were broadcasting radio programming into the Eastern Bloc countries. People listened to it, and we were telling them things like, rise up against your government. Isn't freedom great? Don't you want to live in a Western-style country? And when they rose up, we did nothing. We stood by while the Red Army just rolled into Budapest and brutally crushed the revolt and killed thousands of people. And we shrugged our shoulders and said, well, what do you want us to do? We can't paratroop in and rescue you. It's too heavily fortified. And so I took a lesson from this brutal uprising in Hungary and the way it was repressed, that we need to develop other systems like the CIA. People had high hopes that maybe we could find an end to the Cold War peacefully when there was some successful negotiations. In 1956, Nikita Khrushchev, new leader of the Soviet Union here, and Ike negotiated an end to the occupation of Austria. Austria had been occupied since World War II. It had been divided right down the middle, just like Germany. We could not decide what to do with it. And finally, we decided neutralization would be the answer, meaning that Austria would neither be in NATO or the Warsaw Pact. It would be neither aligned to the Soviets or us. Neither side could station troops there. That it would be truly neutral like Switzerland. And we would simultaneously withdraw and the country would be left to its own devices. Miraculously, this worked. And it gave a lot of hope to a lot of people that maybe we wouldn't blow each other up over Germany and that we could use the same model in Germany we did in Austria. It wasn't to be. Austria is no Germany. Austria has a small population, 6-7 million people. Germany was 70 million, much richer, and neither side was willing to sacrifice, and neither side trusted the other. Yet there's some successes there. The first time that a Soviet leader and an American leader met in the United States, Khrushchev actually came to the US for a tour, traveled all around. Here he is with Richard Nixon, the vice president in the 50s. And they went to a very interesting kitchen expo, right? Where I don't know if you guys ever go to these, but like every year there's these big expos. Like you guys probably go to things like Comic-Con and stuff like that to see all the new, Marvel movies that are coming out or whatever. Kitchen expos are like, we have a new line of spatulas, come and check them out, right? Or new aprons. And so Nixon was showing Khrushchev all like a typical American kitchen, almost like when you go to IKEA and they have the mock, model of an apartment there. You would go in and see a kitchen with a toaster and an electric washing machine and a dryer and toasters and all kinds of stuff like that. And Khrushchev was blown away. He was like, this is like what the president has, right? Or rich people. And Nixon says, no, the average American can have a fridge in their home because of competition, because the government doesn't plan all of this stuff. We let the market handle it. It allows Americans to be richer and wealthier. This was known as the kitchen debate. And honestly, Nixon kind of trounced Khrushchev in this. Millions of people around the world saw it because it was all recorded and put out on television. And there was no denying that Americans lived a much better lifestyle than the Soviets did. Even wealthy Soviet people had to get on waiting lists to buy a car, you had to get on a waiting list for 4 or 5 years to buy a telephone because they were rationed. Even in peacetime, they just didn't have enough. What we lived under for 4 years during World War II, they lived under even a worse system of it perpetually, forever, just to the end of time. And yet there was a black market for if you were a government official and powerful, you could get all this stuff you needed. So there was corruption, of course, on top of it as well. So the Soviets then decided they were going to prove to us that they were still superior in certain areas. And so they launched Sputnik in October of 1957. And that really shocked the world. How on earth could the Soviet Union, like their scientists aren't as clever as ours, they're not as rich as us, yet they launched the first rocket into outer space, and they had a little satellite. It was like the size of a basketball, basically, with a little antenna on it, and just went beep, beep, beep. That's all it did. Yet it humiliated the United States. Now, how did the Soviets do this? At the end of World War II, everyone was very excited to get a hold of German technology. Now, the Germans were very backwards in a lot of areas of the war, but in certain areas, they were light years ahead of us, mostly in rocket technology. They had developed the V1 and V2 rocket, and they were very, very good. Their scientists, their physicists were the best in the world. So there was this race in Berlin to capture all these scientists, interrogate them, and then bring them back to our respective countries. Now, the Soviets were way different. What they did is capture these people and kidnap their families and bring them back to the Soviet Union and made them work 16 hours a day for 10 years and threatened to murder them and their families if they didn't help. America did something that, I don't know, maybe it's not as good. It's certainly nicer to the scientists, but we took scientists like Heisenberg and Werner von Braun and said, hey, you're great at rocket technology. How do you like to come to the US, you and your whole family? And we'll just forgive you and give you a nice house in Nantucket, and you'll live a very nice lifestyle. This was known as Operation Paperclip. One of these sort of deals with the devil that the CIA made, that we basically said, look, we're putting a lot of bad Nazis on trial at Nuremberg, but a lot of them know valuable information. And the best way to get it is to just grant them amnesty, give them a US passport, let them live here. And they tell us everything they know. The Soviets were much harsher, and they said, we're not forgiving you for what you did to us, and we're going to use blunt force. That is how they developed this rocket technology so fast. It was through this German technology. And so this stimulated a crash program in America that we had to get on this too. So highly competitive, right? We're racing them in nuclear weapons. We're racing them in conventional weapons. Now there was going to be a space race. So you had an arms race. Now you're going to have a space race. And the Soviets got out on a good lead in the space race, but we would beat them by forming NASA, funding it, and then in 1969, landing 3 men on the moon. And we just dropped the mic and said, all right, who's going to top that, right? So the CIA also is going to, in an exponential way, increase covert operations. This is a very dark period of American life. Again, when people talk about the 50s, they never like to bring this stuff up. The US government did things that nobody is very proud of and are rather disturbing in retrospect. I already told you about the Italian elections. One might be able to justify that. Nobody was killed, and I think the good guys did, in fact, win, but it does raise a question. What right do we have to out and out rig other countries' elections, right? If people want to live under communism, should they not be able to elect it? And we thought, no, we know better than these Italians, and we're going to rig their election for them. Then it got even darker. Starting in the 50s, the US began to use the CIA to overthrow governments throughout the world and impose upon these countries, usually right-wing dictatorships that were friendly to the US interests. What's sparking all of this happening is decolonization. Many of these countries in Africa and in Asia and Latin America had been dominated by foreign outsiders for so long. And what happened with World War II, a weird thing happened, and that is that because the Japanese invaded and took over so much of Asia and then lost, there was this debate. Well, are the old colonial regimes coming back? Like, who's coming back to Indonesia to govern? Are the Dutch going to come back, or are we going to grant independence to Indonesia? And the US leaned on most of these other countries and said, we're leaving the Philippines, you guys need to leave too. And the US convinced the British to get out of India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, convinced the Dutch to get out of Indonesia. The only country that was really just not hearing this was France. France had been humiliated by World War II, and they wanted to prove how tough they were by beating up on Asian and African peoples. And so that's what they did. They would stay in Vietnam for quite some time. That didn't end very well. They would stay in Algeria for a long time. That wouldn't end very well. And throughout what was known as the Third World, these countries are getting on their feet. They're incredibly poor. The old colonial masters have left. And so what they start to do is nationalize certain industries. Nationalize is the opposite of privatize. Privatize means a certain resource is turned over to private industry to exploit. Nationalism is when the government would take control over it, right? So in some countries like ours, the oil is owned by private companies, unless it's on federal land, which is not always the case, and usually is not the case. In Mexico, for instance, all the oil is owned by the government. It's owned by Pemex. Same thing with Venezuela, same thing with Saudi Arabia, same thing with Nigeria. Some countries do it through nationalism or nationalization. Some countries do it through privatization. Iran technically had not been a colony, but Britain had come in, and so had America, and bought up all of the oil fields in the 40s. They had a king, the Shah. Shah is just the Persian word for king. And after World War II, they wrote a constitution. They were trying to have this peaceful transition to democracy. The Shah was deposed peacefully, and they had parliamentary elections, and Mohammad Mossadegh became the prime minister of Iran. Now, don't be fooled because his name is Mohammed. He was not an Islamic extremist at all. He wore a suit and tie like Western leaders. He did not wear traditional Islamic garb. He was not a religious leader in any way. He was just a regular Western type leader. But what he did, what so upset Britain and France, was he was going to nationalize the oil. He was going to go to these British and American companies and say, we're taking control over the oil that's in our country, and we are going to compensate you, but it's going to be pennies on the dollar for what it's actually worth. And America and Britain did not like that very much. Part of it was money. Part of it was these corporations thought, we invested a fortune in developing all these oil wells and everything, and this government's just going to steal it from us. That's not right. But also there was a strategic consideration, and that is that Iran is right on the border with the Soviet Union. Oil was running the world in the 50s. It still does to a large extent. And the feeling was the Soviets already have a lot of oil in the Caspian, and if they ever were able to invade Iran, they could take control over it. So we need to have control over it, or maintain the control that we do have. And so the CIA, when they heard that Mossadegh was going to nationalize the oil, they decided to get rid of him. And so the CIA and MI6, the British intelligence service and covert operations department, started a coup basically in a foreign country. We met with certain army officials in Iran that didn't like Mossadegh. The military in most countries is usually conservative and doesn't like, the liberal government. Um, those leaders wanted him gone and wanted to take control themselves. And so we basically paid them to create all kinds of problems in the country. We paid shopkeepers to keep their stores closed so that people couldn't go out and buy food and diapers for their kids and stuff. We paid people to riot, made signs for people and said, down with Mossadegh. What does my sign say? Doesn't matter. Just go out there and protest. Tip over cars, break windows, and do stuff. And here's $20 a day, which is more than most Iranian people made in a year. This created such havoc and chaos in Tehran, in the capital, that the military said, hey, there's riots going on, Mossadegh, get control, or we're going to take over. You have 72 hours to leave the country. And so he fled the country and the military took over. On the surface, it looked like just an internal problem, that they had an internal coup, but really the US and Britain paid to create this situation, which in retrospect is rather extraordinary. This is almost impossible to perpetrate today. Countries have gotten wise to this, so they have a lot of mechanisms in place to prevent this from happening. We would love if we could just get rid of Kim Jong-un or the communist regime in Cuba with a simple coup. It doesn't work anymore. Countries were not as aware that we could do this at the time, and just talk about the power. Just by spending money, we could topple governments on the other side of the planet. We could prevent the communists from taking control in Italy through elections, and we could actually depose an elected prime minister. The Shah is brought back and put back on the throne, and a very authoritarian government is put in its place. It's very odd. If you look at Iran from the 50s through the 70s, it was a Western style country. The Shah was not a religious leader either. Women did not have to wear the veil. They could go down to, the beach and wear a bikini. You could drink alcohol. So in many ways, it was very free, but they did have a secret police that would arrest people and torture people. There were no, parliaments. There was no political parties, no criticism of the Shah. So they would have a revolution later in 1979 that would inaugurate this new Islamic regime that they still have to this day, these religious leaders. And so it's very weird. Today they have a regime that's even worse, but what they justified at the time in the 70s was that, well, like it or not, we don't want the regime that America forced upon us. Right? They saw the Shah as a puppet of American imperialism and wanted him gone, rightly or wrongly. This is known as blowback, when the CIA will topple a government and it seems okay in the short term, but then in the long term, it really upsets a certain part of the world. Still to this day, Iran hates us and we hate them. It might blow your minds to find out that Iran used to be the closest ally of the US in the Middle East, even more than Israel. Iran had our back. In the 60s and 70s, you could count on the Shah of Iran. He had our back. And if you wanted to be an ambassador, you wanted to be the ambassador of Iran, because it was a very friendly country. It's not that way anymore because of the coup that we perpetrated there in 53. Then in Guatemala, we did the same thing. Same circumstances. They had elections in Guatemala, and this new elected leader, Jacobo Arbenz, decided that the only resource that Guatemala has is land, that they are basically one big banana and coffee plantation, and that United Fruit owned like 80% of their country. And United Fruit is this American corporation. No matter how hard Guatemalans work, all the profits are going to go to this foreign corporation. So he said, let's have land reform. Let's take control over the land and distribute it to Guatemalan people. By the way, this is not so radical an idea. We did this. We stole a continent from the indigenous people, and through the Homestead Act, just distributed it to poor white folks, and it was good for the poor white folks. This would have been very good for Guatemalan people, but to America in 1954, this seemed like communism. Arbenz was no communist. He was just a regular reformer. He was, democratic. And so we decided to get rid of the guy. We met with certain military leaders in Guatemala. We built air bases and military bases in Honduras with the permission of that government, trained sort of a guerrilla force of Guatemalan soldiers in Honduras. And then they marched on the capital and murdered the elected president of Guatemala and installed a very right-wing dictatorship for a long time in Guatemala, all through the 50s, 60s, and 70s. They had this right-wing military junta imposed by the United States on their people. These are things that we're not proud of, that we look back now and say that was not a good thing that we did. I don't want to get you too down on America. The Soviets were doing things that were even worse. And this is what happens when you become a global leader. You get your hands dirty because you excuse it by saying, if we don't do it, the Soviets will be even worse. We need this country to be allied to us. If we got to overthrow a democracy, we have to do it. And we did it. I'm sad to say. Okay. We can go ahead and end there. Next time we meet, I was going to say we're not really meeting, I suppose. But next time I start talking about the 50s and 60s, we will start talking about the end of Eisenhower's presidency and the beginning of Kennedy and sort of the early 60s. And then that'll be it. Okay. All right, ladies and gentlemen. Hopefully you enjoyed that, and I'll see you next time. Okay. Bye-bye.